The fog of war. How a 3-cent solution changed everything. October 23rd, 1944. Normandy, France. 0530 hours. The fog came first, thick as woolen gauze, carrying the metallic smell of rain-soaked earth and something else. Cordite, perhaps, or the phantom memory of yesterday's dead. Staff Sergeant William Edward Jones pressed his cheek against the stock of his M1903 Springfield, feeling the wood's familiar grain against his stubbled skin, and squinted through his unerdal scope at absolutely nothing. White, pure, impenetrable white. Behind him, in the stone ruins of what had once been a Norman farmhouse, Private James Robert Thompson shifted his weight, causing ancient masonry to grind softly. Jones didn't need to look to know his spotter was nervous. 22 years old, Thompson had been in country for 3 weeks, long enough to learn fear, not long enough to master it. "Can't see shit, Sarge," Thompson whispered, his Carolina drawl making the profanity sound almost polite. Jones said nothing. He was thinking about home, not the sentimental way the replacements did, mooning over sweethearts and mom's apple pie, but practically. Specifically, he was thinking about his father's tobacco farm, about mornings just like this, when fog rolled down from the Blue Ridge Mountains and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. His father had taught him something useful then. Moisture is the enemy of precision. A damp cigarette won't light. A wet rifle won't fire true. And a fogged scope is just expensive glass. The problem sat between his eyes and the target. Condensation. Physics. The temperature differential between the cold October air and his own body heat was turning his 8-power scope into a milk bottle. Every few minutes he had to lift his eye, wipe the lens with his sleeve, reacquire his firing position. In the seconds it took to clear the glass, a German soldier could cross 20 yards of open ground. 20 yards was the difference between a clean shot and a miss. A miss was the difference between Thompson going home to his girl in Asheville and Thompson going home in a box. Or not going home at all. Jones reached into his musette bag, feeling past the wax paper of K-rations, past the loose .3006 rounds that clinked softly like spare change, past the New Testament his mother had pressed into his hands at the train station in Charlotte. His fingers found what he was looking for in the interior pocket, wrapped in tissue paper that the supply sergeant had included, with a knowing smirk and zero commentary. The Army issue Condom, manufactured by the Young's Rubber Corporation of New York City for the sum of 3 cents per unit, procured and distributed by a military establishment that understood human nature far better than it understood human dignity. Jones turned the small packet over in his calloused hands. Prophylactic. From the Greek, to guard in advance. The irony wasn't lost on him. "What are you doing?" Thompson asked, watching as Jones tore open the packaging with his teeth. "Solving a problem." The latex unfurled in his hands, translucent, impossibly thin. Jones had never been a religious man. His faith had drowned somewhere in the beaches of Normandy, but he believed in empirical observation. He'd watched rubber stretch and spring back. He'd seen light pass through waxed paper. He understood that materials had properties, and properties could be exploited. The condom rolled over the unerdal's objective lens with surprising ease, a prophylactic barrier between precision optics and the destructive moisture of the Norman climate. Jones secured it with a rubber band scavenged from a rations box, then brought his eye back to the scope. The fog remained, but the lens stayed clear. "Jesus Christ," Thompson breathed. "Does that actually work?" Jones didn't answer immediately. He was tracking movement through the white, 400 yards downrange, where the fog thinned just enough to reveal silhouettes. German infantry, advancing in a skirmish line, moving with the confidence of men who believed the weather had made them invisible. The first shot broke the morning silence at 05:47 hours. Obergrenadier Hans Müller couldn't see his hands. He couldn't see Schmidt, who was supposedly 5 meters to his left. He couldn't see the hedgerow that the briefing map promised would provide cover. And he couldn't see the American positions that battalion intelligence swore were undermanned and demoralized. What he could see, perfectly clearly, was the fog. And the fog wasn't particularly interesting. At 28 years old, Müller had survived 3 years of the Eastern Front, which made him either very lucky or very skilled. He suspected luck. Skill got you promoted. Luck got you transferred to France in the summer of '44, which had seemed like a gift until the Americans arrived and turned the gift into a curse, wrapped in high explosives and .30 caliber certainty. His Carabiner 98K felt heavier than usual. The scope, a beautiful piece of German engineering, Zeiss glass, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was completely useless. Fogged. Opaque. No better than looking through a bottle of milk. He'd removed the rubber lens cover at 0500 hours when the fog first rolled in. Standard procedure. The covers protected the glass during movement, but you removed them before engagement to prevent interference with the sight picture. Now, at 0530, he was realizing that the engineers who designed the scope hadn't anticipated the specific meteorological conditions of a Norman autumn. Or perhaps they had, and simply assumed their soldiers would be occupying Russia by now, where the cold was different, dry, brittle, not this wet, suffocating blanket. Every 30 seconds, Müller paused to wipe the objective lens with his sleeve. Every 30 seconds, the condensation returned. It was like fighting entropy itself. You couldn't win. You could only delay defeat. Somewhere ahead, through the white, an American was waiting. Müller knew this the way you know things in war, not from intelligence reports or tactical briefings, but from the pressure in your chest, the prickling at the base of your skull, the ancient hindbrain's recognition of being hunted. The shot, when it came, sounded wrong, muffled, distant. Not the sharp crack of a Garand or the staccato rattle of a BAR, but something older, heavier. A precision instrument deployed with malicious intent. Feldwebel Otto Schneider, 30 meters to Müller's right, stumbled forward 3 steps before his brain caught up with the fact that his heart had stopped beating. He collapsed into the white like a marionette with cut strings, and the fog swallowed him whole. William Edward Jones wasn't the first soldier to improvise. Military history is a chronicle of desperate men solving urgent problems with inadequate resources. Wellington's army had fought in boots lined with newspaper. Sherman's soldiers had wrapped their feet in canvas when leather ran out. In every war, logistics lagged behind necessity, and the gap was filled by ingenuity or death. But Jones's innovation, the condom trick as it would become known, represented something more profound than simple field expedients. It represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy, one that would prove more decisive than any individual battle. The German Wehrmacht in October of 1944 was still, in many ways, the most professionally trained military force in the world. Their soldiers were disciplined, their officers educated, their equipment engineered to exacting standards. The Zeiss scope on Müller's Carabiner 98K was a masterpiece of optical precision, ground and polished by craftsmen who understood refraction and aberration at a molecular level. It was designed to provide clarity at range, to turn a skilled marksman into an artist of death. What it was not designed to do was function when covered in water. When German ordnance officers later learned about Jones's innovation, interrogating American prisoners who mentioned it with the casual pride of men discussing a clever hunting trick, they initiated a formal review process. The memo, filed on November 17, 1944, wound its way through the Wehrmacht's bureaucratic architecture, from battalion to regiment, from regiment to division, from division to Army Group B headquarters, where staff officers debated material science and procurement logistics, while American soldiers were already implementing the solution across the entire front. The German response, when it finally came, was characteristically thorough and characteristically late. Engineers in Jena designed a specialized latex lens cover, manufactured to precise specifications, tested in laboratory conditions that perfectly simulated Norman fog. The covers were approved for production on December 9, 1944. They were scheduled for distribution in January of 45. They never arrived. The factory was in Silesia, and by January, the Red Army was 40 kilometers away. Between 0547 and 0747 hours on October 23, 1944, William Edward Jones fired 63 rounds from his Springfield. 48 of those rounds found their target. Thompson kept count in a small notebook, using a stub of pencil he'd borrowed from a chaplain in St. Lo. Later, much later, he would tell the story to a reporter from Stars and Stripes, and the reporter would ask why he bothered counting. Thompson couldn't articulate the answer. Not really. But Jones understood. In the chaos of combat, numbers provided structure. Numbers were objective. A man could forget his fear if he was busy with arithmetic. The targets weren't random. Jones had learned his craft hunting white-tailed deer in the Pisgah National Forest, where patience mattered more than speed, and shot placement mattered more than firepower. You didn't aim for the biggest buck. You aimed for the angle that would drop it instantly, humanely, with minimal suffering. War had stripped away the humanity, but the technique remained. Officers first. Easy to identify, even through fog, by their posture and position. They stood straighter. They carried themselves with the arrogance of education and authority. Shot 1. A lieutenant checking his map, 0547 hours. Range, 420 yards. The bullet entered through his left temple as he turned to shout an order. And whatever that order was, it died with him. Radio operators second. The antennas gave them away. Thin metal stalks protruding from backpack radios like skeletal fingers pointing at heaven. Shot 4. A communications specialist crouched behind a hedgerow. 0550, 2 hours. Range, 380 yards. The bullet shattered the radio before passing through his chest. Static and silence, in that order. Machine gunners third. The most dangerous targets, the ones who could kill the most Americans. Jones could identify them by their movement patterns. 2 men working in tandem, one feeding belts while the other controlled the weapon. Shot 9. The primary gunner on an MG-42, 0603 hours. Range, 450 yards. Shot 10, 15 seconds later. His assistant, who had the misfortune of trying to take over the position. Range, 448 yards. The machine gun fell silent. The fog persisted. The condensation remained. But Jones's scope stayed clear, protected by 3 cents worth of latex and a farmer's practical understanding of moisture barriers. Thompson called out ranges, estimated from his position using binoculars that fogged up every 30 seconds. His job wasn't to provide precision, that was Jones's domain, but to give general direction and confirm kills. The confirmation was important. In fog this thick, you couldn't always see the impact. You fired, you waited, you watched for the silhouette to crumble or the movement to stop. By 0630 hours, the German advance had stalled completely, not because of artillery support, there wasn't any, or reinforcements, they hadn't arrived, but because of a single rifleman with clear optics and a steady hand. The 746th Grenadier Regiment, tasked with pushing through the American line before the fog lifted, had lost every NCO, every radio man, and every heavy weapon operator in their forward companies. What remained wasn't an army. It was a collection of terrified men, pinned down by an invisible enemy, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat, waiting for orders from officers who were already dead. Feldwebel Otto Schneider, who had survived the shot that killed the lieutenant, tried to organize a withdrawal. He lasted 17 minutes. Shot 32. 06:47 hours. Range 395 yards. The bullet found him as he crouched behind a stone wall, shouting instructions to soldiers who couldn't see him and wouldn't obey him even if they could. By 07:30 hours, the German line had collapsed into chaos. Men were running, not retreating, not withdrawing, but running, back toward their own positions, abandoning weapons and wounded, driven by the primal terror of being hunted by something they couldn't see or fight. A few tried to return fire, shooting blindly into the fog, but they had no target. Jones had positioned himself inside the farmhouse ruins, behind stone walls that muffled the muzzle blast and concealed the flash. Each shot sounded like it came from a different location, a ghost army of snipers that existed only in the Germans' imagination and fear. The last shot came at 07:47 hours. A German corporal, braver or more foolish than his comrades, attempting to recover a wounded soldier from the open ground. Jones watched him through the scope, watching him struggle with the body, watching him look up at the fog as if it might offer salvation. The bullet caught him in the chest. He fell next to the man he'd been trying to save. Thompson marked it in his notebook. 48 confirmed kills, 2 hours, fog conditions, clear optics. Then the fog began to lift, and the killing stopped. Not because Jones had run out of targets, but because the Germans had run out of courage. October 24th, 1944. 18 hours after his triumph, William Edward Jones became a prisoner of war. It happened during a German counterattack, a desperate attempt by Wehrmacht forces to reclaim the ground they'd lost. Jones and Thompson had been repositioned to a forward observation post, a hastily dug foxhole near what the maps optimistically called Route D12, but what the infantry knew as that fucking road where Baker Company got chewed up. The attack came from the north, not the east, where intelligence had predicted. Panzers, supported by infantry that had learned from yesterday's mistakes. They didn't advance through fog. They waited for clear skies and overwhelming force. Jones got off 3 shots before the artillery barrage began. He remembered the sound, not the explosions, but the sound before the explosions, the whistle of incoming shells, like wind through a narrow canyon. Then the world turned to fire and pressure and darkness. He woke up buried in earth, his left leg twisted at an angle that his brain refused to process. Thompson was screaming somewhere nearby, though whether from pain or fear, Jones couldn't tell. Then German voices, harsh and rapid, and hands pulling him from the dirt with efficiency that bordered on gentleness. The wound was bad. Not catastrophic, he could feel his toes, could wiggle his foot, but bad enough that standing was impossible, and walking was a delusion. Shrapnel had torn through his calf, severing muscle and possibly nicking bone. Blood soaked through his trousers, hot and sticky, carrying with it the sharp metallic taste of shock. A German medic, young, maybe 19, with careful hands and exhausted eyes, applied a tourniquet and injected morphine. Jones tried to ask about Thompson, but couldn't make his mouth work properly. The morphine was strong, or perhaps shock was stronger. The world became soft and distant, as though he were watching someone else's war through dirty glass. They carried him on a stretcher, 2 German soldiers who breathed hard under his weight. Jones, in his morphine haze, wanted to apologize for being heavy. The thought struck him as funny, and he laughed, and the laughter made his legs scream, which made him laugh harder until the morphine dragged him under. Jones expected to die, not immediately. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, and the morphine had stopped the pain. But eventually, inevitably, in whatever hole the Germans threw prisoners who were too broken to march and too expensive to treat. He'd heard the stories, every soldier had. Wehrmacht prison camps where Red Cross parcels arrived if you were lucky, where medical care meant a bandage and a prayer, where infection killed more men than bullets. The Geneva Conventions were a nice idea, thoroughly discussed in training, and thoroughly irrelevant once you crossed the English Channel and discovered that war didn't care about international law. They transported him in a truck, bouncing over roads cratered by American artillery, each bump sending fresh waves of agony through his shattered leg, despite the morphine. Other prisoners huddled around him. Thompson, thank God, alive and mostly whole, clutching a bandaged hand. A private from 3rd Battalion whose name Jones never learned. A corporal who'd lost his mind somewhere between capture and transport and now, sang lullabies in a child's voice. The truck stopped at a field hospital, German, marked with red crosses that Jones didn't trust, and his expectation of death solidified into certainty. Here's where they would triage him. Too damaged to save, too American to prioritize. He'd seen enough combat medicine to understand the mathematics of survival. Supplies were limited, manpower was scarce. You saved who you could and let the rest slip away with as much dignity as morphine could provide. A Wehrmacht officer approached the stretcher, accompanied by a doctor in a blood-stained surgical gown. They spoke in rapid German, examining Jones's leg with professional detachment. Jones closed his eyes, prepared for the shake of the head, the apologetic gesture, the final injection that would turn sleep into something permanent. Instead, they picked up the stretcher and carried him inside. The shock hit him before the anesthesia. Not physical shock, he was already deep in that particular hole, but psychological shock. The kind that rewrites your understanding of reality in an instant. They were operating on him, on an American prisoner, immediately, without hesitation, without a waiting line of German soldiers who clearly deserved priority. The surgical theater was clean, not field hospital clean, but actually clean, with white sheets and sterilized instruments and electric lights that didn't flicker. A surgical team assembled around him, the doctor, 2 nurses, an anesthesiologist who spoke English with a Viennese accent and asked, politely, if Jones had any allergies. Allergies, as though this were a hospital in Charlotte, not a German surgical unit in occupied France. I don't understand, Jones managed, his voice thick from morphine and confusion. I'm the enemy. The anesthesiologist adjusted his mask, revealing eyes that carried their own exhaustion. Herr Sergeant, he said quietly, the Hippocratic Oath doesn't recognize national borders. Now breathe deeply, please. Count backward from 10. Jones tried to ask more questions, tried to understand this impossible mercy, but the anesthesia swallowed him before he reached 7. He woke to stitches and splints and the stunning realization that he still had his leg. The doctor, Hauptmann Hermann Weiss, as Jones would later learn, had spent 3 hours reconstructing muscle, removing shrapnel, and saving what the war had tried to destroy. Not because Jones was valuable, not because his survival served any strategic purpose, but because Weiss had taken an oath before Hitler rose to power, and he decided that the oath mattered more than politics. Thompson visited that evening, escorted by a guard who looked barely old enough to shave. His hand was bandaged, but functional. Minor shrapnel, nothing that would prevent him from returning to combat once the Germans sent him to a POW camp. He sat beside Jones's bed in the prisoner ward, surrounded by wounded men from both sides, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Thompson said, "They gave you blood." "What?" "During the surgery, I asked one of the nurses. They gave you 2 units of blood, German blood, from their own supplies." Jones stared at the ceiling, trying to process this information. Somewhere in his veins flowed the blood of a German soldier. Perhaps someone from the 746th Regiment. Perhaps someone who'd been standing in that fog when Jones squeezed the trigger. The irony was too vast to name. "How many?" Jones asked. Thompson didn't need clarification. 48. You got 48. No. Jones shook his head, immediately regretted the movement as pain flared. "No, I mean how many men are in this ward? How many Germans did we wound?" Thompson looked around the room, counting silently. 14. Maybe 15 if you count the guy in the corner who I'm not sure is breathing. Jones did the mathematics. 48 Germans dead, 14 wounded. A ratio that spoke to accuracy and lethality, and the fundamental unfairness of clear optics in foggy conditions. And now, here he lay, saved by the same army he decimated, treated by doctors who saw wounds instead of flags. "I don't understand this war," Thompson said finally. Jones closed his eyes. "Neither do they." Jones spent 6 months in German captivity before liberation arrived in the form of Patton's Third Army, rolling through Germany like a steel tsunami, crushing what remained of Hitler's fever dream. The prison camp where he'd been transferred, Stalag 12A, near Limburg, had been a place of slow starvation and slower death. But Jones survived on a combination of Red Cross parcels, black market trading, and the simple, stubborn refusal to let a German bullet finish what German surgery had saved. His leg never fully healed, even 70 years later, walking with a cane that had been carved from Carolina oak by a grandson who'd never seen war. Jones would feel the phantom ache of shrapnel and surgery, a permanent reminder of October 44. He returned to North Carolina in June of 1945, decorated with a silver star he didn't want, and haunted by memories he couldn't articulate. The farm had survived the war better than he had. His father was older, his mother grayer, but the tobacco still grew in neat rows, and the morning fog still rolled down from the Blue Ridge, exactly like it had in Normandy. The reporter from Stars and Stripes found him in September, armed with Thompson's notebook and a hunger for hero stories that post-war America desperately needed. Jones told the story mechanically, leaving out the parts that mattered: the fear, the doubt, the morphine dreams, the surgeon's kind eyes, and focusing on the parts the reporter wanted: the innovation, the body count, the American ingenuity that won. The war won improvisation at a time. The article ran with the headline, "Sniper's Condom Trick Bags 48 Germans." The tone was triumphant, celebratory, proud. It made Jones sound like a carnival sharpshooter, not a traumatized farmer who'd killed more men in 2 hours than most soldiers killed in an entire war. He never corrected the record. What would be the point? The truth was too complicated for newspaper prose, too tangled in moral ambiguity to satisfy readers who wanted queer victories and queerer villains. Thompson visited once in 1952, driving up from Asheville in a Buick he'd bought with his GI Bill money. They sat on the porch drinking sweet tea that Thompson's wife had made, watching the sun set over tobacco fields that neither of them farmed anymore. Thompson had become an accountant. Numbers, he said, were safer than bullets. They didn't talk about the war. Not directly. Instead, they talked around it, the way veterans do, discussing weather, mentioning names of men who hadn't made it home, acknowledging, without stating, that they'd shared something no civilian could understand. As Thompson prepared to leave, standing beside his Buick with the engine already running, he turned back and said, "Do you ever think about him? The doctor?" Jones knew immediately who he meant. Every day. Me too, Thompson said. Then, after a pause, do you think he made it? Jones had no answer. He'd tried to find out, writing letters to Army liaisons and Red Cross offices, but Hauptmann Hermann Weiss had vanished into the chaos of post-war Germany. Perhaps he'd survived. Perhaps he'd been killed in the final, desperate weeks of the Reich's collapse. Perhaps he was living in Munich or Stuttgart or Berlin, treating patients and remembering the American sergeant he'd saved, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. I hope so, Jones said finally. I really hope so. The condom trick became standard procedure in the United States military, not through official directive, but through the organic transmission of practical knowledge. Soldiers told other soldiers. Snipers told other snipers. By 1945, every American sharpshooter in the European theater carried prophylactics in their kit. Not for their intended purpose, well, not only for their intended purpose, but as optical protection against moisture, dust, and the general hostility of the environment. The innovation persisted through Korea, through Vietnam, through every conflict where American forces operated in conditions where water and precision optics intersected. It was mentioned in sniper training manuals, demonstrated in specialized schools, and eventually adopted by other militaries who grudgingly admitted that sometimes the Americans had good ideas, even if those ideas involved repurposing personal hygiene items for tactical advantage. But the deeper legacy, the one that mattered more than any individual technique, was what the story represented about military culture and organizational adaptability. The Wehrmacht, for all its professional excellence and engineering prowess, had been fundamentally rigid. When confronted with an unexpected problem, it responded with bureaucracy, with formal reviews and proper channels, and engineered solutions that arrived too late to matter. The American military, despite its reputation for institutional inertia and Byzantine regulations, had cultivated something more valuable, a culture that empowered individual soldiers to solve their own problems with whatever resources they had available. This wasn't doctrine. It wasn't taught at West Point or codified in field manuals. It was something more fundamental, a recognition that wars are won not by the army with the best plans, but by the army with soldiers who can improvise when the plans inevitably fail. William Edward Jones, tobacco farmer, didn't know he was demonstrating organizational theory. He was just trying to keep his scope clear so he could do his job and keep Thompson alive. And maybe, just maybe, make it home to North Carolina. The fact that his improvisation became doctrine, that his 3-cent solution saved countless lives in future wars, that his story would be told in military academies and sniper schools for the next 80 years. None of that was intentional, but it was, perhaps, inevitable. Because that's how real innovation happens, not in laboratories or planning rooms, but in farmhouse ruins in the fog, when necessity and ingenuity intersect, and someone has the courage to try something that sounds absurd until it works. In 1978, 34 years after the war, a letter arrived at Jones's farm in North Carolina. It had been forwarded 3 times, passed through Red Cross channels and veteran organizations, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led from Stuttgart to Charlotte, to a tobacco farm that was now owned by Jones's son, but where Jones still lived in a small cottage near the main house. The return address was German. The handwriting was careful, precise, the script of a man who'd been educated when penmanship mattered. Jones opened it with shaking hands. Dear Sergeant Jones, I do not know if this letter will reach you, or if you will remember a brief encounter in October of 1944, when you were brought to our field hospital with a severe leg wound. I am Dr. Hermann Weiss, formerly Hauptmann in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, and I was the surgeon who operated on your injury. I have thought of you often over these many years. You were one of hundreds of soldiers I treated during the war, but I remember you specifically because of something that happened during your surgery. As we worked to repair your leg, extract shrapnel, and reconstruct damaged muscle. My assistant, a young nurse named Elizabeth Hartman, asked me why we were expending so much effort on an enemy soldier when our own wounded were waiting for treatment. I told her what my professor in Vienna had told me when I was a medical student. The oath says, "Do no harm." It doesn't say, "Do no harm to Germans." If you cannot treat all patients with equal devotion, you have chosen the wrong profession. Elizabeth survived the war. She became a physician herself. Last year, she wrote to me from her practice in Hamburg, mentioning that she'd treated a young man who'd been wounded in an industrial accident. His family had no money. The insurance was complicated. Her colleagues suggested transferring him to a public hospital where the financial burden wouldn't fall on their private practice. She treated him anyway. She said she'd learned from watching me operate on you that medicine is not conditional on convenience or politics or profit. She said you'd taught her that lesson, though you never knew it. I write to tell you this because I suspect, though I cannot know, that the war weighs on you as it weighs on all of us who survived it. You were a soldier. You did what soldiers do, but perhaps it brings some comfort to know that your suffering, inadvertently, taught a young nurse that mercy transcends borders. And that lesson has now rippled forward to save others. I hope your leg healed as well as could be expected. I hope you returned to whatever life you had before the madness interrupted it. I hope you found peace. With respect, Dr. Herman Weiss Jones read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with his silver star and his discharge papers, and the small notebook where Thompson had counted kills on a foggy morning in France. He never replied. What could he say? That the leg ached in winter? That he dreamed of fog? That he'd spent 34 years wondering if the doctor had survived, and now he knew, and the knowing somehow made everything worse and better simultaneously. Instead, he walked outside, leaning heavily on his cane, and looked up at the Blue Ridge Mountains, where fog was beginning to gather in the valleys. Somewhere in Germany, a young man whose name Jones would never know was alive, because a doctor had once treated an enemy soldier with mercy, and that mercy had taught a nurse a lesson that rippled forward through time. 48 men dead, 1 man saved. The mathematics didn't balance. They never would. But perhaps, just perhaps, the moral weight was more complicated than simple addition. The fog rolled in, thick and white, carrying the smell of earth and autumn. Jones watched it come, and for once, he didn't think about snipers or scopes, or the thin barrier between life and death. He thought instead about mercy, about oaths, about the unexpected ways that humanity persists even in the machinery of war. The fog obscured everything, but behind it, if you knew where to look, the mountains remained. Solid, enduring, unchanged by the violence that had swept across the world and finally receded, leaving only memory and letters and the stubborn insistence that some things, some precious few things, mattered more than victory. Staff Sergeant William Edward Jones died in 1996 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Asheville Citizen-Times mentioned his Silver Star and his service in the Second World War, but made no reference to the condom trick, or the 48 confirmed kills, or the morning fog in Normandy that changed everything. And nothing. Dr. Hermann Weiss died in 1983 in Stuttgart. His obituary mentioned his work in reconstructive surgery and his contributions to trauma medicine, but made no reference to the American sergeant, or the field hospital, or the young nurse who learned mercy by watching him operate. Elizabeth Hartman continued practicing medicine in Hamburg until her retirement in 2005. In interviews, she occasionally mentioned the war, though she rarely discussed specifics. Once, when pressed by a medical student about the ethics of triage, she told the story of an American soldier and a German surgeon, and the lesson she'd learned about the Hippocratic Oath's indifference to nationality. The student, who had no context for the story and no understanding of the war beyond history textbooks and Steven Spielberg films, found the anecdote mildly interesting and promptly forgot it. But that's how knowledge survives, imperfectly, incompletely, transmitted through stories that lose details with each retelling until only the essential truth remains. Medicine is not conditional. Mercy transcends borders, and sometimes, in the fog of war, a 3-cent solution saves more lives than billion-dollar weapons. The condom trick is still taught in modern sniper schools, though most students don't know its origin. The specifics have been lost to time and military bureaucracy. But somewhere in Fort Benning or Quantico, or wherever the military trains its sharpshooters, an instructor demonstrates the technique, and young soldiers learn that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that improvisation can trump engineering, and that the most important skill in war isn't marksmanship or tactics or strategy. It's the ability to look at what you have, recognize what you need, and figure out how to bridge the gap with whatever's in your pocket. Even if what's in your pocket is just a 3-cent piece of latex, and the practical wisdom of a North Carolina tobacco farmer who understood that moisture is the enemy of precision, and precision is the difference between life and death. The fog always lifts eventually, but the lessons remain.